It's Halloween in Wisconsin. And that means only one thing. Beer. And Halloween-themed game reviews. When I think of horror-themed video games, the first ones that come to my mind is the Castlevania series. Castlevania started out with 3 strong showings on the original Nintendo, had a couple Game Boy games, and 3 games released for the North American 16-bit generation. Funny enough, I owned the original Castlevania as a kid, but had somehow never played any of the other games until recently. I have a feeling there was some deep emotional scars from all those flying Medusa heads from my childhood. This will be a 2-part review, so let's start in reverse with the 16-bit era of Castlevania games. As the original Nintendo started to fade and the 16-bit era took over with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, we received a brand new batch of Castlevania games to play. Starting first, let's take a look at Super Castlevania 4 on Super Nintendo. Simon Belmont is back to vanquish Dracula and return peace to Transylvania. Simon is now able to whip in 8 different directions, as well as use his whip as a shield. You can also fling it around, which is surprisingly pretty useful. Fans often see Castlevania 4 as the best game in the series, and for good reason. This takes everything that was good from the original and improves upon it. The action is fast-paced, and the environments are nicely detailed. As with most Castlevania games, the soundtrack really stands out. There are so many good tracks in Castlevania 4 that are bound to set off the nostalgia alarm. I am such a sucker for great video game music that it's often the deciding factor on what grades I give in the reviews. Rarely do you find a shitty game that has quality music. Video game music to me is like that perfect blend of spices that you put on a good steak. You don't really need it, but it can take something good and make it perfect. On the other hand, you can spice up a turd all you want, but it's still gonna play like shit. And I know this is a little off track, but I challenge everyone here to play Peacekeepers for 20 minutes and then tell me if having a little music wouldn't have made it much more palatable. There are a few areas in Castlevania that I found really frustrating the first time through. The most frustrating part for me, and it really makes no sense, is the section where you need to race the clock or die to a giant saw blade. It's actually not even that hard, but if you jump and then hold on to the jump button, Simon will stop moving and the stairs will fall. I guess it was just instinct for me to hold the jump button, and it took me a few deaths to figure it out. There are another couple levels that are fairly challenging on the platforming end. The bosses, however, are very easy. You don't seem to take much damage from anything in Castlevania 4, so you can just tank the bosses most of the time. Given that your whip can hit from almost every direction, makes them all pretty easy to hit as well. The bosses all have a predictable pattern, and it was hard to lose to them even on my first try. I did have a lot of issues dealing with the mummy though. There's not really a good place to stand, and he constantly moves towards Simon and pushes you off the platforms. The final stage has a good old boss rush before Dracula. Like the other bosses, they're pretty trivial once you figure out the patterns. Getting to them is harder than beating them. The Grim Reaper makes his usual appearance, and he can be pretty challenging for a while. A good hint here is to point your whip straight up in the air, and you can shield all of his attacks. And just like the titles before this, there is a mercy checkpoint right before Dracula. In this title specifically, there is a hidden platform you can go to, which will fill up your hearts and hands you the best items in the game. Funny enough, I didn't realize that there were stairs between these platforms, so feel free to watch my failure montage. Lastly, you make it to Dracula, and the battle is very reminiscent of the first game. Dracula teleports around while throwing fireballs, summoning little fire dudes, and shooting laser beams. He's not really that hard though, just avoid his projectiles and spam boomerangs at his face. This fight can take a couple minutes, but at least he only has one form to beat. Deal the final blow and watch your cutscene. You deserve it for getting this far. And that's Super Castlevania 4. Hard as hell at times, but a bona fide classic. The music, graphics, gameplay, and controls are all spot on. In an era of action platformers, Super Castlevania 4 excels in just about every aspect of gaming, and for that, it earns 5 stars. Castlevania Dracula X. So Castlevania Dracula X is commonly referred to as a bastardized version of a PC Engine game named Castlevania Rondo of Blood. Rondo is one of those games that purists often agree to as the best Castlevania game of the 16-bit generation. While I haven't played Rondo myself, so my views on Dracula X are going to be focused simply on what this particular game has to offer. This game starts out a couple hundred years after we last saw Simon Belmont. Transylvania has been cursed, and Dracula has enacted his revenge on the Belmont family by kidnapping newcomer Richter Belmont's girlfriend and sister. Right away, you're going to notice that Dracula X is a pure throwback to the original Castlevania. Richter's movement is very stiff, but he does have the ability to do this kick-ass backflip. It's useful in a lot of situations. All the weapons from the first game have returned, but really only the axe and boomerang feel any sort of useful. If you collect enough hearts, Richter is able to perform a super move that sort of clears the screen sometimes, but does massive damage to stage bosses. The music is by far my favorite thing about this game. You'll hear plenty of wonderful renditions of Castlevania staples, along with a lot of new groovy tunes. Even if you harbor an irrational hatred for this game, you cannot deny how great the soundtrack is. The other major thing to point out is the difficulty. Dracula X is one tough son of a bitch, much like the original Castlevania. Medusa heads come out in full force, and they do not fuck around. The platforming can be quite difficult in areas, and this game is packed full of these spear knights. These enemies like to edge hog all day long and feel like RNG hell trying to figure out their patterns. It doesn't help that they take like 5 hits to kill. Also, the bosses are much more difficult than their Super Castlevania counterparts. Since you can only whip what's directly in front of you, it's hard to land hit on a lot of the bosses without items. They also don't take a whole lot of damage, so these fights can last a long time. One interesting thing to note is that there are secret paths that you can take in Dracula X if you want to save your sister and girlfriend. There are hidden keys you must find and hold on to until you find their holding cells. If you rescue these women, some of the stage bosses will be different, and you may get a slightly different ending. But fuck that, this game is already hard enough the first time through. At last, we make it all the way to Dracula, and honestly, he's not really all that hard. He teleports around shooting projectiles, but as long as you're hanging out on one of the lower pillars, you're pretty safe. His second form is a little interesting. I guess Dracula is only at full power in the nude, or he's a fan of pro wrestling. Well, it's the same strategy as before. A good tip for this fight is that while Richter is ducking, he can't be thrown backwards. So just make sure you duck before eating projectiles. It's going to take a lot of patience to finally get to that end screen, but it's so worth it. So in conclusion, I actually rather enjoy Dracula X. It's definitely the weaker of the two SNES Castlevania titles, but it succeeds as a pure throwback. In my opinion, looking at some of the shitty reviews for this title, it seems that most reviewers are unable to separate this from Rondo of Blood, or they complain about the gameplay. Well, if we're honest, Dracula X accomplished exactly what it set out to do. If you love the original Castlevania, then you're probably going to enjoy this game. The graphics aren't too shabby, the soundtrack is fantastic, and the controls are exactly what they need to be. I think it's entirely fair to give Castlevania Dracula X a decent 3.5 out of 5 stars. For those who want to check this out, be aware that finding an authentic copy on the Super Nintendo will put you back nearly $200. But I do believe it was released on one of the Wii or Wii U virtual consoles, so it's a good bet if you're just looking to play it. Now, we've spent some time talking about all the Castlevania games on Super Nintendo, but what about our boys over at Sega? Well, here's a late release Genesis title called Castlevania Bloodlines. Let's see if Sega can indeed do what Nintendo don't. This game follows two new vampire hunters, John Morris and Eric Lecard, in their quest to stop the Countess Elizabeth Bartley from resurrecting Dracula. This game does things a little differently. Instead of just storming Dracula's castle, you travel throughout Europe killing his monsters. Now let's be real for a second. Sega was definitely the edgier of the two companies. Just take a look at the title screen. It definitely has that mature feel to it. Kinda reminds me of Splatterhouse. As for the game, it actually feels a lot like Castlevania 4. You can pick between John and Eric in the beginning, and that's who you will play with for the entire game. As far as I know, these are the first and only appearances of these two characters in the series. John Morris is your classic Castlevania protagonist. He has the Vampire Killer Whip, he can whip in many different directions while jumping, and he can go full-on Spider-Man by latching onto platforms. Eric Lecard is John's best friend, who joins him on a quest for revenge against Elizabeth Bartley. He uses a long-range spear and can do some pretty fun things with it. With this spear, he can do this fancy twirling attack, which has limited uses, but he also has this amazing long jump move. With this, Eric can reach high platforms, and he is invincible during the animation. It's very helpful during boss fights later in the game. The graphics are a lot of fun, and no one screen lacks any detail. There are a lot of great effects that show off the capabilities of the Sega Genesis. In the Shrine of Atlantis, for example, there's a really cool mirrored water effect. Check out the Leaning Tower of Pisa. There are a ton of great rotating and foreground graphics in here. Italy in general is always rotating in this game. Lastly, check out this trippy effect in England. I don't even know how to describe it. It kinda looks like a glitch at first. Konami definitely pushed the limits of the console. One of the best parts of Bloodlines is the stage in Germany. Since this game takes place in June of 1914, and World War I officially started in July of 1914, I guess it's safe to assume that Dracula had something to do with it, and now we have proof. I guess German labor was too expensive, so they sent in skeletons and this gear boss who looks like he belongs in Vector Man. The only real hard part for me came in stage 5. I absolutely hate these swinging scythers. Their patterns are super annoying to figure out. Towards the end of the game, you meet a familiar foe in the Grim Reaper, and I found his fight to be pretty interesting. At first he flings around a bunch of cards. Picking one will either take you to a boss fight or provide food. Thankfully, he isn't using Exodia. Finally, after defeating Death himself, you get to fight Elizabeth Bartley, or maybe she's Medusa. I'm not super into the lore of Castlevania, so maybe somebody can explain that one to me in the comments below. Well anyway, she's extremely easy to beat and doesn't really do anything. The fight with Dracula at the end takes a very long time. His first form is the same thing we've seen in just about every game. He just teleports around endlessly and barely does anything. His second form looks a lot like the Grim Reaper we just faced. Here he flies around and hurls projectiles at you. This is pretty easy, except when he teleports right into you. His third and final form is really strange. I'm not actually sure how to describe this. His waist grew teeth, and he shoots fire out of his cock. What the fuck? Bloodlines is probably the easiest Castlevania game of the 16-bit generation. None of the levels are overly frustrating, and the bosses are maybe just slightly harder than those of Castlevania 4. But for what it lacks in difficulty, it more than makes up in overall enjoyment. This is just such a solid game from a technical standpoint on the Sega Genesis. Everything flows nicely. The music, well, a little Genesis-y, is great, and the graphics are just as good as anything else released on the Sega Genesis. Castlevania Bloodlines is a must-own on Sega, and it definitely earned itself a perfect 5 stars. This is one of those games that generally rises in price over time, so buy it if you can find it.